Silence is not empty. Silence has a job, and most people never discover what that job actually is until it is already working against them. When you stop reaching for the avoidant, something shifts that has nothing to do with distance and everything to do with control. The person who built a wall to protect their nervous system suddenly finds that wall has no purpose when nobody is trying to break through it anymore. What happens inside a mind that was designed to escape pursuit the moment pursuit disappears? What happens to a system built entirely around avoidance when there is nothing left to avoid? This is not a story about winning someone back. This is a story about what collapses inside a person when the one thing keeping their identity intact is suddenly gone. Because the avoidant does not fear closeness the way people assume. The avoidant fears something far more dangerous, something almost nobody has explained correctly, and once you understand it, you will never see distance the same way again. Most people believe the avoidant runs because they do not care. That belief is comfortable because it turns a complicated psychological pattern into a simple moral failure. But the truth sits somewhere far less comfortable. The avoidant runs because caring feels like exposure, and exposure feels like danger, and danger triggers a survival response that was written into their nervous system long before they ever met you. This is not a character flaw. This is architecture. Somewhere in their early emotional development, closeness became associated with loss of control, and control became the only form of safety they ever learned to trust. So when you disappear, when you stop initiating, stop chasing, stop offering the emotional labor that once kept the connection alive, you are not just withdrawing attention. You are removing the exact condition that allowed their avoidance to function properly. An avoidance pattern only works when there is something to avoid. This is the part almost nobody explains correctly. The avoidant did not build emotional distance for no reason. They built it as a defense mechanism against pursuit, against demand, against the fear of being consumed by another person's needs. When you pursued them, even gently, even quietly, you gave their defense system a job to do. Every text they did not answer, every emotional conversation they postponed, every ounce of space they created, all of it depended on the presence of your energy pushing toward them. Remove that energy, and their defense mechanism has nothing left to defend against. This is the moment most people misunderstand as indifference. It is not indifference, it is disorientation. A wall does not know how to feel useful once nobody is trying to climb over it. Human beings build psychological walls the same way nations build fortresses, not because they enjoy isolation, but because they fear invasion. The avoidant spent years reinforcing an internal fortress designed specifically to withstand emotional intrusion. Yet a fortress with no invader does not feel safe. It feels empty. And emptiness triggers a completely different kind of fear, one the avoidant rarely admits even to themselves, the fear of irrelevance. If nobody is trying to get close anymore, what does that say about their worth? What does that say about the effort they spent building distance in the first place? Suddenly, the very protection they created starts to feel like abandonment they inflicted upon themselves. This is where the psychological unraveling begins, and it rarely looks like sadness at first. It looks like restlessness. It looks like checking, waiting, replaying old conversations, searching for signs of a shift that has not happened yet. The nervous system that once found comfort in distance now finds distance intolerable because for the first time, the distance is not something they control. Silence stops being a tool and starts being a mirror, and mirrors are far more dangerous than walls because a wall keeps things out, while a mirror forces things to be seen. Human beings can tolerate almost any external hardship far easier than they can tolerate an unfiltered reflection of themselves. This is a truth philosophy has understood for centuries, and psychology continues to rediscover in every generation. The Stoics warned that man suffers not from events themselves, but from the meaning he assigns to them. The avoidant assigned meaning to distance as safety. But once distance becomes involuntary, once it is no longer a choice they are making but a consequence they are experiencing, the meaning collapses, and what remains underneath is raw, unprocessed emotion. They spent years learning how to avoid feeling in the first place. Crashing out, as it is often called, is not weakness. It is decompression. Think of a diver who spent months at extreme depth, where pressure becomes so normal that the body forgets what the surface feels like. When that diver rises too quickly, the internal structure cannot adjust fast enough, and the body reacts violently to a change most people would consider relief. This is precisely what happens inside an avoidant when the emotional pressure of your pursuit disappears. Their internal world was structurally adapted to manage closeness by escaping it. When closeness is removed entirely, when there is nothing left to escape, the sudden absence creates its own form of psychological pressure, one they were never trained to withstand. Empaths often misinterpret this unraveling as proof that distance was the answer all along, but that interpretation misses a deeper truth about their own psychology, one far more uncomfortable to face. The empath did not simply love the avoidant. The empath often unconsciously needed to be needed. Rescuing became identity. Chasing became purpose. Every moment spent decoding mixed signals, every ounce of energy spent trying to earn consistency, became a hidden source of self-worth disguised as devotion. This is the part attachment content almost never explores honestly. The empath is not merely a victim of avoidance. The empath is often addicted to the emotional labor required to manage it. This creates one of the most overlooked psychological loops in modern relationships. The avoidant fears engulfment, so they create distance. The empath fears abandonment, so they close that distance by offering more effort, more patience, more emotional generosity than the relationship requires. Every time the empath closes the gap, the avoidant feels the walls tighten, and every time the avoidant pulls back, the empath feels the ground shift beneath them. Two nervous systems, each responding to a different fear, unknowingly reinforcing the exact conditions that keep both of them trapped in the same unstable cycle. Neither person is the villain. Both are prisoners of unconscious protection strategies they mistake for personality. When the empath finally goes silent, something extraordinary happens to this loop. The pattern that once sustained itself through mutual reaction suddenly has no fuel. And here is the deeper truth almost nobody says out loud. The silence does not only affect the avoidant, it exposes the empath to themselves as well. Without the chase, without the anxious energy of managing another person's emotional distance, the empath is forced to sit with a question they spent the entire relationship avoiding through busyness and effort. Who am I when I am not trying to earn someone's presence? This question rarely arrives gently. It arrives like a sudden silence in a room that used to be filled with noise, and silence of that magnitude forces confrontation whether a person is ready for it or not. The empath who built months, sometimes years, around managing another person's emotional weather suddenly finds themselves standing in an internal landscape they never had time to examine. Without the avoidant to chase, without a pattern of hope and disappointment to regulate their days, the empath discovers an unfamiliar stillness, and stillness for someone addicted to emotional labor can feel almost unbearable at first. Discomfort of this kind is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that something long buried is finally surfacing. Every unresolved fear, every unexamined belief about worth, every quiet suspicion that love must be earned through relentless effort, all of it begins rising the moment the external distraction disappears. Human beings are remarkably skilled at avoiding themselves through the pursuit of someone else. The moment that pursuit ends, there is nowhere left to hide, and this is precisely when real transformation becomes possible, though almost nobody welcomes it in the beginning. Philosophy has always understood that suffering reveals structure. Nietzsche did not say that which does not kill you makes you comfortable. He said it makes you stronger, and strength requires friction. Emotional stillness after prolonged chasing is friction of the highest order because it forces a person to face the architecture of their own self-worth without the noise of another person's inconsistency to blame. This is where many people quit too early, mistaking the discomfort of self-confrontation for evidence that they made the wrong choice by walking away. Meanwhile, on the other side of this silence, something equally unsettling begins happening inside the avoidant, though it rarely announces itself the way pain usually does. It begins as curiosity disguised as indifference, a quiet noticing, a small, almost irritating awareness that something which used to occupy space in their mind no longer does. Human attention operates like a spotlight, and for a long time that spotlight had grown accustomed to dimming whenever it approached emotional closeness. Now the spotlight has nothing left to dim against, and an unfamiliar kind of attention begins forming, one the avoidant has no practiced strategy for managing. This is the part almost no one talks about honestly. Avoidance is not the absence of feeling. Avoidance is the postponement of feeling, stored carefully, layer by layer, until the postponement itself becomes unsustainable. When pursuit stops, postponement loses its function because postponement only works when there is pressure to delay. Without pressure, the emotions that were pushed aside do not disappear. They accumulate, and accumulation, whether financial, physical, or emotional, always eventually demands release. This release rarely looks dignified. It can appear as irritability, restlessness, sudden interest in the person they claimed indifference toward, or an unexplainable heaviness that seems to arrive from nowhere. Many people call this crashing out, but a more accurate description would be psychological thawing. Something frozen for protection is finally beginning to melt, and melting is messy by nature. It does not happen in clean, convenient stages. It happens unevenly, unpredictably, and often at the exact moment the avoidant least expects it. There is a paradox hidden inside this entire dynamic that deserves far more attention than it typically receives. The very thing the avoidant feared, engulfment, closeness, emotional demand, was never actually coming from the other person's love. It was coming from their own unresolved relationship with vulnerability. The empath was never truly the threat. The threat was always the internal experience of being seen, known, and depended upon in ways that felt unfamiliar and unsafe. When the empath withdraws, the avoidant is not merely losing a person. They are losing the external structure they had unconsciously built their entire identity around avoiding. Identity, more than affection, is often what collapses first. Human beings construct self-concept not only through what they pursue, but through what they resist. If a person spends years defining themselves as someone who does not need closeness, who does not get attached, who values independence above emotional entanglement, then the sudden absence of anyone to resist creates a strange identity vacuum. Who becomes the strong, detached, self-sufficient one when there is no longer anyone pulling at their boundaries? This question destabilizes far more than people expect, because identity built on resistance requires something to resist in order to remain intact. This is where character reveals itself more honestly than emotion ever could. Some avoidants, faced with this vacuum, will retreat further, doubling down on isolation as a way to avoid confronting what the silence has exposed. Others will experience a rare and uncomfortable moment of clarity, recognizing for the first time that their distance was never really about the other person at all. The difference between these two outcomes rarely depends on how much someone was loved. It depends entirely on how willing they are to face what their own avoidance was actually protecting them from. Suffering, when interpreted correctly, becomes information rather than punishment. The empath who feels the ache of silence is not being shown that they were wrong to leave. They are being shown the parts of themselves that confused self-worth with usefulness. The avoidant who feels the unfamiliar discomfort of being forgotten is not being shown that they made a mistake by creating distance. They are being shown how much of their identity depended on controlling the emotional temperature of every relationship they entered. Neither realization is comfortable, but comfort was never the purpose of this experience. Growth rarely announces itself through comfort. It announces itself through the specific kind of discomfort that refuses to be ignored. There is a deeper truth still waiting beneath all of this, one that most people circle around without ever naming directly. Attachment wounds do not heal through proximity. They heal through the capacity to remain whole in someone's absence. As long as the empath needed the avoidant's presence to feel secure, security was never truly theirs. As long as the avoidant needed distance to feel safe, safety was never truly theirs either. Both were borrowing stability from external conditions, and borrowed stability always collapses the moment those conditions change. What each person is now being forced to confront, in very different ways, is the difference between a stability that depends on another person's behavior and a stability that exists regardless of it. This distinction between borrowed stability and earned stability is not theoretical. It shows up in the smallest, most ordinary moments of daily life, long before it ever shows up in a grand realization. It shows up when the phone stays quiet and a person either spirals into checking it every few minutes or continues eating their meal without interruption. It shows up when a memory surfaces unexpectedly and either hijacks an entire afternoon or passes through the mind like weather, noticed but not obeyed. Stability that depends on another person announces itself through these micro-reactions, and most people never notice how much of their peace was actually rented rather than owned until the rent stops being paid. Consider for a moment an old idea from Stoic philosophy that rarely gets applied to modern relationships with any real precision. Epictetus taught that some things are within a person's control and some things are not, and that suffering begins the moment a person confuses the two. The empath, without realizing it, spent the relationship trying to control something that was never controllable, the internal emotional state of another human being. Every act of patience, every attempt to say the right thing at the right time, every strategic softness deployed to avoid triggering withdrawal was an attempt to manage something fundamentally outside their reach. This is not a criticism. It is simply the mechanism of how good intentions become exhausting labor. What almost nobody says clearly enough is that the avoidant was engaged in the exact same error, just aimed in the opposite direction. Instead of trying to control another person's emotions, they were trying to control their own emotional exposure by controlling the relationship's proximity. Distance became their version of managing the unmanageable. Both people in their own way were reaching for control over something that was never theirs to control in the first place, which is precisely why silence, real silence, becomes so disruptive. It removes the illusion of control from both sides simultaneously, and illusions rarely dissolve quietly. There is something almost cruel about how growth tends to work, though cruelty is not quite the right word. It is closer to precision. Growth does not ask permission. It arrives exactly where a person is weakest, strips away whatever coping mechanism has been overused, and forces a confrontation with the raw material underneath. For the empath, that raw material is often a belief formed long before this relationship began, the belief that love must be chased, proven, or maintained through relentless effort, or it will disappear. For the avoidant, that raw material is frequently a belief that closeness inevitably leads to loss of self, so distance must be maintained even at the cost of connection. Neither belief was invented in this relationship. This relationship simply activated wounds that were already waiting. Here is a psychological insight rarely discussed with any honesty in mainstream content about attachment styles. Avoidance and anxious pursuit are not opposites. They are mirror expressions of the same underlying fear, the fear of not being enough exactly as one is. The avoidant fears that if someone truly gets close, their flaws will be discovered and rejection will follow, so they leave before that can happen. The empath fears that if they stop performing effort, their value will be questioned, so they overextend before rejection has a chance to arrive first. Both strategies are preemptive, both are exhausting, and both, ironically, produce the very outcome each person feared: distance on one side, depletion on the other. Once this mirror is seen clearly, blame becomes almost impossible to sustain. It becomes far more difficult to villainize someone whose defense mechanism you now recognize as a distorted reflection of your own. This does not mean the relationship should continue, and it certainly does not mean either person was without responsibility for their behavior. It means the story stops being about who hurt whom and starts being about what each person's nervous system was desperately trying to protect, often at the expense of the very connection they claim to want. Real transformation begins the moment a person stops asking what the other person should have done differently and starts asking what pattern inside themselves keeps attracting or creating the same emotional weather across different relationships. This question is uncomfortable because it removes the safety of external blame. It is also the only question capable of producing lasting change because patterns that are never examined simply relocate into the next relationship wearing a different face. Silence in this context becomes something far more powerful than a tactic or a boundary. It becomes a mirror held up to both people at once, revealing not who was right, but what each person still needs to heal. The avoidant staring into that mirror sees a version of themselves that has spent years mistaking isolation for strength, when true strength was never about the absence of connection, but about the presence of connection without losing oneself inside it. The empath staring into that same mirror sees a version of themselves that mistook exhaustion for love, when love was never meant to require the erosion of one's own peace to be considered real. Neither of these realizations arrives instantly. They arrive slowly, often disguised as restlessness, irritability, unexpected tears, or strange bursts of clarity in the middle of ordinary tasks. Healing rarely resembles the dramatic moments portrayed in stories. It resembles a gradual shift in what a person tolerates, what they chase, and what they no longer feel compelled to explain or defend. The person who once needed constant reassurance slowly becomes someone who can sit in uncertainty without spiraling. The person who once needed distance to feel safe slowly becomes someone who can experience closeness without feeling erased by it. This shift cannot be forced through willpower alone. It requires the uncomfortable, unavoidable confrontation that only genuine silence seems capable of creating. Nobody is coming to hand you your power back. It was never taken. It was postponed, buried beneath years of chasing, explaining, and shrinking yourself to fit inside someone else's fear. The silence you are sitting in right now is not punishment. It is invitation. An invitation to stop outsourcing your peace to someone whose nervous system was never equipped to hold it. Stop waiting for a crash out to prove your worth. You already know your worth. The only question left is whether you will keep abandoning yourself while you wait for someone else to notice, or whether you will finally choose the one relationship that determines every other relationship in your life, the one you have with yourself. Close this chapter today, not with anger, not with revenge, with decision, because the moment you stop needing someone to come back, you become someone nobody can afford to lose.